Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, and I was glad we were able to join through the use of this video. I started my job as the coordinator for the United Nations for the response to Ebola virus disease in August this year, and during that time I've made 2 visits to the most affected countries in the region. I've also spent some time in Nigeria and in Senegal, and I've worked with the governments of a number of countries that are seeking to assist with the response, together with major non-governmental partners and also with many within our United Nations system. I've just returned just now from New York, where I participated in a number of high-level events in the UN in New York. I thought I'd start with a brief assessment of what's happening in the region from a public health and then societal point of view. I'd then like to talk a bit about the pattern of response up till now, and I'd like to finish with description of aspects of the response as we hope it will be taken forward in future. Be very happy to address concerns that the audience might have, if I can be helpful. My only slight constraint is that I've got to move on to another meeting quite quickly, and so that might not work. So when I was appointed, I started to work with the Director General of the World Health Organization to try to understand what has happened. And the outbreak started in the interior part of Guinea in March, Guinea Forestière, or at least that's when cases were first detected. I expect it was there for a bit beforehand. And it looked as though it was going to die out in the normal way that these outbreaks do by May or June, and then it picked up again, and then it came down again about a month later, and then it had its 3rd peak associated with quite a lot of cases coming up in Sierra Leone and Liberia, coming into August. I think that it was during August that we noticed that it was suddenly accelerating very quickly indeed, and that was when we started to ask ourselves, is this outbreak increasing at an exponential rate? That means a curve that is going upwards. Sometimes people call them logarithmic projections, or not, and we'll talk about that just in a second. I think that there are many who will wish to examine how the outbreak was handled, but let me just give 2 or 3 reflections. There's never been an outbreak of Ebola that we've known in West Africa before. Previous outbreaks have been in Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. Secondly, this particular outbreak has got into urban communities now, and it's moving forward in the cities of Monrovia and Freetown particularly, plus some of the smaller urban areas in Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone. It creates really very different challenges. Previous outbreaks have been in rural areas and have been dealt with using efficient case identification, contact tracing and treatment. And that approach usually leads, or has led up till now, to the outbreak coming under control in a matter of weeks. This one, by getting into urban communities, changed its pattern. Thirdly, there are traditional practices in this part of West Africa that seem to favour the spread of the virus. In particular, what is done with bodies when people pass on from life to death. In the cultures of this part of West Africa, the day of death is often considered the most important day of a person's life. And very important things happen to the spirits inside the body at that time, and they involve the mourners who are present, and a number of rituals are undertaken to do with body cleansing and body touching, which are very, very important for that moment of death. But they're also extremely unfortunate if the person who dies has had Ebola virus disease, because it's a very good way to spread the virus and start new trains of transmission. And so many of the cases that have evolved, particularly in recent weeks, can be traced back to events where healers or chiefs or others were involved in pre-death or death rituals. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the response and how that response has been going up till now. The mainstay of the response is always to try to treat a person who's got the virus as quickly and effectively as possible, and using quite basic therapies to do with nutrition, to do with rehydration, to do with relief of pain, and also treatment of any associated bacterial infections. It's possible to end up, provided people present early enough in treatment centres, with mortality rates of less than 50%. And sometimes they've been got much lower still. Secondly, if it's possible to ensure that everybody who's got the virus is quickly separated from other members of their household and of their community, then that quickly reduces the rate of spread of the outbreak. If around 70% of people with the virus can be separated in this way and be brought into treatment centres, then two things happen. One is that those who are sick get a good chance of survival, and secondly, the outbreak will be reduced fast, because if you can get more than 70% of people isolated, then that really does reduce the transmission rate and lead to reduction. So the mainstay of the strategy is to try to identify people who've got the disease, trace their contacts, keep them under surveillance, separate those with the disease from others, and then bring them under treatment in treatment centres as quickly as possible. And by the middle of August, the situation started to get serious, because all the treatment centres in the region, with around 600 beds altogether available, had become full. Most of these are provided by NGOs, usually working in conjunction with government. Often, when we say by NGOs, we have to recognise the staffing ratio is about 1 international staff to 5 national staff. And they're very efficient and well managed with tight protocols, but they got full. And it was quickly apparent when I started my first visit that the actual limitation on expanding the response to the outbreak was the lack of treatment beds and the shortage of international teams to work with national groups to open up new treatment centres. The second major problem was that burials were not being conducted safely and in a decent way. Thirdly, we were short of laboratory services. Fourth, the people who were providing responses to the problem couldn't get health care for themselves if they got infected. Fifth, there were places which were short of food because of the effects of the outbreak. Sixth, there was a breakdown, as we've heard already, in basic health services, which meant that people with malaria weren't getting treated. Seventh, the financing of workers, particularly those in treatment centres, wasn't getting through. And the result was that people were not turning up for work. It was thought to be too dangerous, and quite rightly so, because a lot of those with the early infections were health personnel as well as traditional healers. Eighth problem is that there is a real lack of societal mobilisation, and communities are just not fully engaged in the response. Ninth problem is that logistics and supply systems are undeveloped, and 10th is a shortage of transport in many places, particularly into the peripheral areas of all the affected countries. The 11th challenge is the real problem of economies going down and into a big decline, kind of wiping out some of the gains that have been made in recent years as a result of economic growth. And lastly, the messaging about this challenge is far too much focused on the death rates and the challenges faced in treatment centres, but we've got whole communities now coming together to be making themselves Ebola resilient in a very exciting way. So looking forward, if we consider that the outbreak is increasing, it looks like exponentially, doubling every 3 weeks in Liberia, every 4 weeks in Sierra Leone, the reaction has to be to really scale up access to Ebola care and to scale up in all these other areas I've just described. And we did some calculations and suggested that to get in front of the outbreak, a 20-fold scale up is necessary. And you might have thought, certainly when I started this work, that that was impossible, but with the announcement of extraordinary inputs from the United States, from Britain, and then big increases in support from an awful lot of other wealthy nations, powerful inputs from the African Union, and also from the African private sector. And with the arrival of foreign medical teams from all over the world, and particularly from countries with experience in handling Ebola, a 20-fold scale up compared with late August might be a bit extreme, but we're certainly seeing a potential for a 10-fold scale up as a result of many of the pledges that have already been made. And it's brilliant that you have a minister from the UK Department for International Development who herself has taken real leadership in this. And despite some of the challenges that are often faced politically, when you've got many emergencies running at the same time, there's been a recognition on the part of the British government, the US government, and many others, that if this outbreak is not properly contained with speed and in a way that supports the people and the institutions of the region, then its long-term impacts are potentially so enormous they don't bear thinking about. The United Nations is doing its first ever public health emergency mission. We've never done it before. Absolutely never. And the Secretary General, after I returned from my second visit, and I said to him, I'm really worried about how we're going to get to scale on this, said, let's give it a try. We'll use a lot of the resources that we use for peacekeeping missions, but we won't use soldiers. We will make it a public health mission with a focus on logistics, a focus on infection control, and a focus on scaling up action to decentralise and reach into the districts and into the provinces and into the counties. I just a few minutes ago been talking to President Koroma of Sierra Leone. I'm delighted that we are being led by another great Sierra Leonean. I had the opportunity of working with several of your colleagues recently, and most delightfully with the actor Idris Elba, who's become a really staunch supporter. But I want to just stress to you that President Koroma, President Johnson Sirleaf, and President Alpha Conde, all of them have really welcomed the idea of this big logistical backbone and the platform that it provides, so that as we scale up, we won't be found wanting for a lack of the support services that are necessary. And then last point, as Britain moves into a major event on Thursday to get a focus on Sierra Leone, building on an event that took place last Friday in the White House, which focused on many issues, but particularly concentrated on Liberia. I think we're beginning to see the level of solidarity, the global solidarity that is necessary to deal with this most exceptional and really unpleasant problem in a way that supports the governments and the people, and that doesn't undermine their own ability. And let's hope that at the end of this all, we have done everything we possibly can to strengthen health systems and societies so there won't be any more tragedies like this one. Thanks for the chance to speak.
Thank you, David. Thanks for that. I'll ask you, as you said, I know your time is limited, but I'll ask you a question or two, and maybe some of the panel may want to ask, and who knows. I don't know how much time you
Well,
can
I
give
feel
us.
I've gone on too long. I ought to, just until the next meeting, until I get disturbed, let me just sit here.
Okay.
And I'd love to hear the other panellists. I've just suddenly realised I hadn't really confirmed with you how long to speak for. But you would probably jumped up and down and said, shut up at some point if I was talking too much. Thank you.
Just a quick one, really. You mentioned the 2 visits, and I just wondered if you could tell us what changes you saw between your first and second visits, and you know, what sort of what were the most dramatic things that had been done, and what were the things that had not been done between those 2 visits.
Well, perhaps the most troublesome thing was just to arrive at treatment centres that I'd seen under construction in the first visit, and then 3.5 weeks later to find that they'd opened and got full within 2 or 3 days. It was always distressing to be at a treatment centre and find people arriving and often falling out of taxis because the taxi drivers didn't really want them sitting in their taxis for too long, and often not really surviving past the entrance to the treatment centre. And then perhaps the most difficult statistic of all is always the numbers of bodies of people who have passed that are having to be taken away. So you had those sorts of indicators of worsening, but also the stories from people in the communities. I went to the same community twice, in Painesville Town Hall, just in outside Monrovia, and listening to the genuine wish of communities to understand what was going on. I mean, so often in life, when something bad happens, you look for the cause inside your community, inside your religion, and they were perplexed and not understanding. In fact, as one of the presidents said to me, I sometimes feel I need to apologise to my people that this is happening, not because we've caused it, but because we don't understand it and we're finding it very hard to respond to it. So there was a perplexity, frustration, sometimes anger, but also determination to own the issue and respond to it together. And that was just deepening and increasing on my second visit. Third thing, I noticed that the governments were increasingly realising just how the problem was rising in that exponential way, and were determined to do everything they could to get on top of it. These are fragile states, but they're not failed states. And they are definitely run by governments who would like to do the best they can. And then I saw big shifts, actually, really, and the more I've thought about it since, the more I've realised how dramatic these were. And then fourthly, realising that our own UN system, which has got some quite well-developed mechanisms for dealing with a humanitarian crisis, using the clusters and setting up humanitarian coordinators, has not had something like this before and was having to reinvent. And this was causing all of our institutions challenges. You have to put WHO in the lead, but not as an organisation that does a lot, because they don't have operational capacity of the level that's needed. They can't replace Médecins Sans Frontières. So the role of WHO is very important, and the role of the rest of the system is interesting. And so that's why the second visit, it was when I set out my idea for the mission. And the point I made to the Secretary General afterwards was, we do have to have unitary command here, but not necessarily a unified control system. And I was very clear that you can separate command and control, and provided there's a unitary command that everybody respects, they can maintain separate control systems and still do well. But I said this is probably much more important than our more normal approach, which is to coordinate, because coordination itself wasn't enough. I actually didn't need to persuade the Secretary General at all. He was so immediately onto it and made a number of metaphors that made me realise that he was in the same space.
David.
And so that's why we moved in that direction.
Right. I'd like to thank you actually for taking the time from what I understand is a very, very busy schedule, and we are enormously grateful that you were able to find some time to brief us today with, I think, something you've given us a lot of information and a lot of food for thought as well. And just like to thank you on behalf of the panel and I think all the audience here. Thank you very much.